What happens when the curtain falls? Not on a role, but on a child. They were legends of the screen, masters of performance, untouchable in their craft. But offstage, they faced the one script no actor can rewrite: grief. This isn't about gossip. It's about the silence behind fame. 13 beloved British actors. 13 unimaginable losses. And the haunting truth no one wants to say out loud: some wounds never heal, no matter how many people applaud. These are their stories, and they were never the same. Before we begin, take a second to subscribe if you haven't already. It helps more than you know. Also, drop a comment. Where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Toronto? Let's see who else is out there, quietly wide awake, drawn to stories like these. 1. Richard Attenborough. The waves arrived like a lie. Too fast, too surreal, too merciless. Richard Attenborough, lorded, knighted, and already 80, was not on the beach in Thailand in 2004. His daughter Jane and granddaughter Lucy were. By the time the water receded, 2 generations of his family had vanished into what the headlines called a natural disaster. That phrase, so clinically passive, would go on to frame the rest of his public life. It was the tsunami. But for Attenborough, it wasn't a headline. It was a deletion. You know Richard Attenborough, maybe from Jurassic Park, twinkling with grandfatherly mischief, or maybe from Gandhi, that vast cathedral of a film, crowned with Oscars and good intentions. He'd lived long enough to become part of British cultural furniture, sturdy, varnished, museum-worthy. But after 2004, something in him seemed tilted. Not broken, that's too clean. Just quietly misaligned, as if the world had shifted a few inches to the left, and he never quite found the right pair of shoes again. He didn't vanish. He still worked, still gave interviews, still smiled, but there was a new cadence behind the eyes, a slow leak of joy even when he talked about the things he loved. One journalist called it crushing sadness tucked behind industry routine. And the phrasing stuck. Because that was the thing. He wasn't undone by grief. He was reauthored by it. The tragedy wasn't just personal. It was planetary. Hundreds of thousands died. So when Attenborough's loss was covered, it often dissolved into the global scale, his pain reduced to a footnote in catastrophe. But family doesn't scale. He once said softly, in an interview almost no one noticed, "You don't move on, you move differently." In the final decade of his life, retrospectives began to shift. Articles that once opened with Gandhi or Brighton Rock now began with the tsunami. Obituaries would follow the same shape. As if his final act as a public figure was not as a filmmaker, but as a father who kept walking anyway. A man famous for directing epics spent his final years haunted not by villains or critics, but by the kind of silence no camera can film. And yet, he wasn't the only British icon who learned that fame can't outright fate. In fact, one of the country's most legendary actresses would face a heartbreak equally public, yet somehow always kept just out of sight. 2. Vanessa Redgrave. She has the cheekbones of defiance, the voice of a queen. Vanessa Redgrave doesn't just act, she declares. Whether in Howard's End, Julia, or simply entering a room, she carries the air of someone who has been both worshipped and burned at the stake. Maybe that's why, when her daughter Natasha Richardson died, so much of the world expected her to disintegrate. She didn't. Natasha was skiing in Quebec when she fell. At first, the injury seemed minor, laughable even. Then the bleeding began, internal, unstoppable. The headlines were merciless in their speed. By the time the family reached the hospital, hope had become a legal formality. Richardson wasn't just Redgrave's daughter. She was part of a theater dynasty, married to Liam Neeson, descended from Michael Redgrave, part of a family tree so ornate it practically belonged in a Shakespearean tragedy. And yet what happened in 2009 wasn't theatrical. It was blunt, fast, and final. Redgrave grieved like she had learned to act with everything and nothing. She gave interviews. She stood at tributes. She didn't collapse. But the interviews changed. Her words grew slower, more sparing. She once said, "You keep working, not because you want to, but because not working would mean thinking too much." The public mourned Natasha, the glamorous couple, the tragic irony of a small fall leading to a total loss. But Redgrave's own grief was quieter, dignified, and somehow absent from most of the documentation. It's the paradox of fame. When everyone is watching, your pain becomes harder to show. In later years, tributes to Natasha often became tributes to the Redgrave lineage itself, as if the entire loss could be absorbed into artistic legacy. Grief, aestheticized, turned into beautiful photos and tasteful lighting. But the absence was not art. It was the loudest role Vanessa ever played, the mother who couldn't fix it. And still, she stood. Perhaps because the British press demands restraint, or perhaps because, when grief is that deep, there's nothing performative left to give. But grief doesn't care about legacies or elegance. It reaches across industries and generations, even to those who'd made a career of cool, where grief, when it arrived, looked less like tragedy and more like a long withdrawal. If you've made it this far, you already know. These stories aren't just about fame, they're about being human. So if that's the kind of depth you want more of, hit subscribe. It keeps the stories coming. And while you're here, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it? Are you in a quiet kitchen at sunrise or lying awake at 2 a.m., headphones on, letting the silence speak? 3. David McCallum. For most of his life, David McCallum looked like the kind of man who could fix things. The icy blue eyes, the clipped precision. From the man from UNCLE to NCIS, he embodied a coolness audiences trusted. He was the professional, the unshakable. And then came the call in 1989. His adopted son, Jason, had died. The reports would later settle on a quiet term that hid more than it revealed: overdose. But behind that headline, there was nothing tidy. Just a father who couldn't fix it. Jason McCallum wasn't in the tabloids much. He wasn't famous like his parents, David and actress Jill Ireland. His life wasn't a screenplay. It was complicated, private, and in pain. That's all the press really offered. But to David, he was a son. The same boy he had taken in, raised, and watched disappear from view. McCallum never turned it into a spectacle. In interviews, he acknowledged the loss without wallowing in it. He said that he had tried to give Jason everything and still couldn't stop what happened. It was, in his words, a lifelong ache. But then he would smile, or shift the subject, or return to work. Decades of it, as if structure was the only answer chaos would obey. To most of the world, McCallum aged into competence. On NCIS, he became the wise pathologist with the measured voice. In real life, he became a man known for punctuality and quiet dedication. But the grief never left. It lingered behind the sharp lines of the script and in the way he talked about family. Even decades later, he would sometimes slip Jason's name into interviews, casually and without preface, like someone who hadn't forgotten, even when everyone else had. This wasn't public mourning, it was private stamina. The kind that doesn't go viral, doesn't make headlines, but keeps a man walking from set to set, year after year, with something unspoken always in tow. And while McCallum kept it restrained, the next story veered closer to the surface, because when the same child is mourned by two actors, the narrative fractures. One held it quietly. The other barely had time to grieve before her own name was etched in stone. 4. Jill Ireland. Jill Ireland's legacy is often summed up in 2 lines: actress and the wife of Charles Bronson. Which is, frankly, a bit unfair. She was also a public figure in her own right, a fierce voice during her battle with breast cancer, and a woman who knew how to light up a screen. But in the last chapter of her life, it wasn't fame or illness that changed everything. It was the death of her son, Jason. Yes, the same Jason McCallum, her son with David McCallum, though by then she had long remarried. In 1989, Jason died of a drug overdose. Less than a year later, Jill Ireland would be gone too. Grief and disease arrived as a tandem act, and neither one had a sense of timing. Jason's death didn't dominate the tabloids, perhaps because his parents weren't together anymore, or because his own life stayed largely outside the public gaze. But for Ireland, it was a wound that didn't heal in time. She was already battling cancer. She had written a memoir. She was in the process of turning her private pain into public advocacy. And then came the loss no script could prepare her for. There isn't a rich archive of Ireland's interviews on Jason. By the time cameras caught up, she was already sick, already slipping away. Biographers now treat the two events, her illness and her son's death, as inseparable. A compression of catastrophe. A kind of narrative blur that leaves the viewer wondering where the pain began and where it ended. And yet, there's something haunting about the symmetry. Two actors, once married. One child, gone too soon. And within a year, both halves of the parenting equation lost something permanent. McCallum, a son. Ireland, both a son and her own future. We often think of Hollywood grief as dramatic. But Jill Ireland's final years were quieter. There was no sweeping camera, no orchestral swell, just pages in her memoir, footage of her speaking to cancer patients, and a slow fade-out. But grief doesn't always follow a linear path. Sometimes it recurs like a family curse, rippling forward to the next generation. And the next actor in our story knew exactly what it meant to bury a son too soon. 5. Alan Bates. Alan Bates was not a man known for wearing his heart on his sleeve. He was known for performances that simmered, intelligent, restrained, intense without ever begging for attention. In films like Women in Love or The Fixer, he played men with secrets, inner fires, unspoken torment. And then, in 1990, the unspoken became very real. His son Tristan died at the age of 19. Suddenly the subtext became text. Tristan Bates was one of Alan's twin sons, born in 1971. 19 years later, he was gone. The precise cause of death is a patchwork of reports. Some say an accidental mixture, others cite heart failure. But the fact that matters most is that he died far too young, and Alan Bates was never quite the same. Unlike many public figures, Bates did not build his mourning into a media narrative. There was no televised eulogy, no red carpet tribute. Instead, he did something more enduring. He helped create the Tristan Bates Theatre, tucked behind the Actors Centre in London. A theatre named not for himself, but for the son who didn't get to live long enough to become a man. A public space, in a private man's name. The loss changed him, that much is clear. Colleagues noted the difference. His pace slowed, his presence dimmed in moments. In later years, Bates would battle his own declining health, and the grief never quite left his face. Some accounts link the deepening sorrow in his later performances, like in Gosford Park, to the emotional well he carried. Maybe. Or maybe that's just us, reaching for structure in a story that won't give us one. There's no interview where Bates lays it bare, no monologue about pain. But when you build a theater for your son, you're saying something louder than words, that art is a form of remembering, that grief needs somewhere to echo. And echo it did, through family, through legacy, and through a quiet thread that connected Bates to another figure in British acting, one who also lost a son, also kept working, and whose life unfolded like a catalogue of quiet catastrophes. 6. Joss Ackland. There are actors who fade gently into the background, and there are actors like Joss Ackland, imposing, gravel-voiced, unmistakable. A man who could make reading a shopping list sound like the end of the world. He worked endlessly, over 130 screen roles, countless theater credits, a face etched into British television like old stone. And somewhere inside that relentless professionalism lived the memory of a son named Paul, who died in 1982 at the age of 29. The cause was heroin. But Ackland never turned it into a moral fable or a public crusade. He simply kept going. If Bates memorialized his son through theater, Ackland memorialized his by not stopping. He once said that acting kept him sane during the worst times, and those times were many. The fire that gutted his house, the accident that left his wife crippled, the slow unraveling of things he couldn't control. Paul's death wasn't a media storm. It didn't dominate headlines or get revisited in retrospectives. Like so many losses in British families, it became something acknowledged and then carefully placed into the quiet. But in Ackland's case, the quiet wasn't absence. It was density. You could feel the weight of things unspoken in every scene he played. He didn't reinvent himself after the loss. He didn't step away. In fact, his most visible work, Lethal Weapon 2, The Hunt for Red October, came after Paul's death. But to read his later interviews is to hear a man who has endured, not triumphed, not overcome, just endured. His marriage, which lasted over 50 years, bore much of that weight. He often credited his wife Rosemary with being the anchor, but even she, later in life, faced terminal illness. It was as if grief wasn't an event for the Acklands. It was a long-term tenant in the house. And yet, despite everything, he never stopped working. Maybe because acting was the one place where the pain could move through him and not consume him. It's easy to assume older actors leave their traumas behind, but Ackland carried his through every era, every performance. And the next figure in our story knew that burden all too well, because his own loss was sudden, devastating, and nearly erased by the elegance of the world he moved in. 7. Christopher Cazenove. Christopher Cazenove looked like he belonged in a royal portrait, chiseled, composed, classically British in the way that made American producers weak at the knees. From the Duchess of Duke Street to the glitzy, melodramatic glow of Dynasty, Cazenove lived inside a polished frame. But in 1999, the frame cracked. His son, Linford James Cazenove, died in a car accident. 25 years old. Just enough time to make a life, not enough to live one. It happened on the M11 motorway. A stretch of road, an ordinary night, and then it wasn't. The kind of tragedy that seems both cruelly specific and grimly universal. But the coverage, much like Cazenove himself, was muted. British obituaries didn't dwell on emotion. The facts were printed, the loss acknowledged, and then the curtains drawn. That's the thing about Christopher Cazenove. He was always the gentleman, in interviews, in roles, in presence. But there's something uniquely cruel about how grief hides in gentlemen. It sits beneath the waistcoat, just out of sight, sipping quietly at the edges of a life that looks impeccable from a distance. Linford's death didn't derail his father's career. The roles kept coming. He returned to stage work, television, the odd film. And yet those who knew him say there was a shift, not an unraveling. Cazenove was too precise for that. But a slowing, a softness around the edges, as if some internal scaffolding had been removed, and what remained was balancing itself as best it could. He rarely spoke about Linford in public. The man who had once embraced the global spotlight of Dynasty now seemed to prefer the half-light of quiet professionalism. British reserve? Perhaps. Or perhaps it was the only way he could remain intact. Cazenove died in 2010, just over a decade after his son. Most retrospectives mention the loss in passing, if at all, and yet it hovers, just beneath the formal biographies, the polished photos, the well-measured obituaries. A missing son, a father who kept going, and a silence so precisely maintained that it became its own kind of performance. But the story doesn't end there. Because Linford had another parent, an actress equally celebrated, and equally changed by the same shattering event. 8. Angharad Rees. In the golden age of British television, Angharad Rees was a luminous presence. Most remember her from Poldark, where she played Demelza with fire and wit, bringing a sharp intelligence to period drama corsets and windswept cliffs. But off-screen, the roles life handed her were far less forgiving. In 1999, she lost her son, Linford, in the same crash that altered Christopher Cazenove's life forever. Linford James Cazenove, named after a long family line, raised between two actors, full of promise. The accident took him at 25. It was the kind of blow that doesn't just injure, it subtracts. What's left behind isn't a before and after. It's a void you walk beside forever. Rees's public reaction was minimal. Interviews from that period are rare, and when they exist, the grief is veiled. But there are subtle tells. The tone of her later public appearances, the soft withdrawal from certain projects, the way her name began to appear more in nostalgic tributes than fresh roles. She never made a scene of it. But the absence was there. It always is. Her second son, Rees, survived. He's gone on to do meaningful work, including supporting her legacy after her death in 2012. But that legacy now bears an invisible shadow. A son who didn't get to grow older, a mother who carried it in quiet. Rees died of pancreatic cancer, and by the time her obituaries were written, the loss of Linford had become a footnote. A personal tragedy mentioned near the bottom, as if chronology had authority over importance. But anyone who has lost a child knows, it's never a side note. There's something tragic in the symmetry of it. Two actors, once married, losing the same son. Two lives, diverged by time and career, intersecting again at a grave neither had expected to visit. And for Angharad Rees, whose screen roles often involved resilience, the reality off-screen was far more demanding than anything the BBC ever scripted. But this thread of loss doesn't end with wartime car crashes or modern illness. Before there were highways and tabloids, before grief came with microphones, one mother found out her son had died while she was still in costume, just minutes before she went on stage. 9. Beatrice Lillie. In her prime, Beatrice Lillie was the kind of funny that made even the stiffest audiences lose their composure. She wasn't just a comic actress, she was a phenomenon. Born in 1894, she brought a style of humor that was elegant, dry, and sharp enough to cut glass. Her career spanned decades, bridging music halls, Broadway, and Hollywood. But behind the luster of laughter lived a private devastation few ever heard her speak of. In April 1942, her only son, Sir Robert Peel, was killed in action during World War II. He was just barely into adulthood. He died serving in the Royal Navy, a standard military obituary, a name in a long list of war dead. The press noted it, the nation moved on, but for Lillie, it wasn't a line in a telegram, it was the fracture point of her life. And still, the show went on. There's a chilling story told about that day, how Lillie received the news of her son's death and then, rather than collapsing, walked on stage and performed. Whether apocryphal or not, the tale survives because it captures something deep in her persona. Stoicism masquerading as sparkle. A mask so perfect it became legend. She never publicly turned her grief into performance. There were no interviews about the agony, no memoir chapters stained with sorrow. But those who knew her said it changed her. Quietly. Fundamentally. The dazzle remained, but the air behind it shifted. As if every laugh she delivered was now an echo from a place that once held joy. Her comedy, which had always thrived on absurdity and subversion, took on an unintended poignancy in later years. The older she got, the more the world read between the lines. Beneath the arched brow and impeccable timing, there was a mother who had outlived her only child. Beatrice Lillie died in 1989. Today, she's remembered primarily as a pioneer of British stage comedy. But somewhere in that history, buried beneath the laughter, is the image of a woman who stood in the wings, got the worst news a parent can hear, and still walked into the light. And in a later generation, another actor, less formal, more cult famous, would carry a loss of his own. His tragedy wasn't spoken in whispers but left behind in baby clothes and quiet remembrance. 10. Colin Baker. For a certain generation of science fiction fans, Colin Baker will forever be the Sixth Doctor: bright coat, explosive charm, and a flair for the melodramatic. His time on Doctor Who may have been polarizing to critics, but to audiences, he became part of the fabric of British genre television. What viewers didn't see, though, was that behind the Technicolor bombast and bravado, Colin Baker was mourning a child he barely had time to know. In the early 1980s, Baker and his wife lost their infant son, Jack. The cause most often repeated is sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS, a term that, even now, comes wrapped in silence. It's one of those losses that doesn't offer a narrative arc. There's no warning, no villain, no treatment, just a before and an after. Jack's death is not widely discussed. There are no televised interviews where Baker spells it out in detail. No sweeping memoir passages. But it appears in biographies, in summaries, in the quiet corners of fan forums where someone inevitably asks, "Did you know?" The answer is always yes, but barely. This is the kind of tragedy that resists the spotlight. And perhaps that's why it fits so uneasily into the world of entertainment. Baker kept working, kept appearing at conventions, on panel shows, reprising roles, taking interviews. He once joked that being the Sixth Doctor meant always being just weird enough to be remembered, but behind the jokes, the records show a man who carried something weightier than any costume. His surviving family remains largely private. That, too, seems part of a pattern. British entertainers of a certain era learned to split the personal from the public. When tragedy entered, it did so through a side door, and was asked not to interrupt the performance. But it did leave traces. In the way Baker talked about parenthood in later years, in the careful phrasing of his recollections, in the subtle, unmistakable presence of absence. And while his stories stayed largely in the shadows, another actor's grief took him from storytelling to something even more direct, turning the pain of a lost child into a mission that would define the rest of his public life. 11. David Kossoff. David Kossoff had one of those faces British television loved: warm, slightly weary, deeply human. He was a character actor, a storyteller, the kind of man who could sit in a chair and make an audience feel like they were listening to something ancient and important. He wasn't the sort of celebrity who needed spectacle. His craft was intimacy, presence, voice. And then, in 1976, the thing he could not narrate his way out of happened. His son, Paul Kossoff, died at just 25. Paul wasn't an actor. He was a musician, a guitarist of immense talent, remembered as one of the greats of British blues rock. His story belongs to music history, full of brilliance and fragility. But David Kossoff's story belongs to something quieter. What happens to a father when the person he loved most becomes a legend before he ever becomes old? The reports are consistent about the broad truth. Paul's death was connected to long struggles with addiction and health complications. The details, as always, become messy in retellings. But what remains solid is the aftermath. David Kossoff was changed. Because when grief arrives in a performer's life, it doesn't always look like collapse. Sometimes it looks like redirection. Multiple accounts suggest that Kossoff took his sorrow and turned it outward, becoming involved in warning others, speaking about the dangers that had taken his son. It's a strange transformation, an entertainer becoming a messenger, a father trying to build meaning out of something that refuses meaning. And there's something painfully British about that response. Not dramatic confession, not public unraveling, just a man quietly repurposing his voice because silence would have been unbearable. What's haunting is how his grief sits between worlds. Paul Kossoff is remembered in guitar magazines, in rock documentaries, in reverent musician circles. David Kossoff is remembered in British television archives in gentle performances, in the soft cultural memory of a different audience. His loss gets stranded. Too much music for film history. Too much film history for music culture. A father's grief floating between categories, never fully claimed. And perhaps that's the cruelest part of losing a child when you're famous. People remember the work, the legend, the highlight reel. But grief isn't a highlight. It's a permanent undertone. David Kossoff lived until 2005. By then, Paul had been gone almost 30 years. That's the mathematics of mourning no one prepares you for, living longer with absence than you ever lived with presence. And yet, even this isn't the end of the story, because the next actor's loss would happen in an era of social media, national nostalgia, and a country that thought it knew him as a symbol of laughter. Until life reminded everyone that comedy doesn't grant immunity. 12. Nicholas Lyndhurst. Nicholas Lyndhurst is the kind of face Britain feels it owns. For decades he was Rodney in Only Fools and Horses, wide-eyed, earnest, permanently caught between optimism and disaster. A national comfort character. The human embodiment of a sitcom shrug. People didn't just watch him, they grew up with him. Which is why, when the news came in 2020 that his 19-year-old son, Archie Lyndhurst, had died, it landed with a peculiar heaviness. Not because grief is rarer for famous people, but because it felt like it had breached the boundary between television comfort and real life. Archie was young, an actor himself, just beginning. His death was sudden, later explained as the result of a brain hemorrhage, with further medical context emerging afterward. The family released a statement describing themselves as utterly grief-stricken and asked plainly for privacy. That request matters. Because modern grief is noisy. The internet turns mourning into commentary, into speculation, into content. But the Lyndhursts drew a line. This was not for public consumption. This was not a storyline. And yet, the public felt it anyway. There was something especially unsettling about the contrast. A father known for bringing laughter into British living rooms, now standing in unimaginable silence. A nation that associated him with jokes suddenly realizing the joke doesn't protect you. Lyndhurst himself did not give the world a dramatic grief narrative. No long interviews, no performance of devastation, just absence. Quiet. The kind of restraint that almost makes the loss louder. Because when someone has spent 40 years making people laugh, the world expects them to return to that role, to restore the balance, to be Rodney again. But grief doesn't care what role you're famous for. It arrives and rewrites the script. And Archie's death remains one of those moments where the public briefly remembers that behind every familiar face is a private life. And behind every private life is the possibility of unimaginable rupture. Nicholas Lyndhurst continues. Of course he does. People always continue. That's the bleak miracle of it. But continuing is not the same as being unchanged. And if Lyndhurst's loss reminded Britain that comedy can fracture, the next story reminds us of something even harsher. Sometimes grief is recent, raw, and spoken about with terrifying honesty, because the person left behind refuses to let it become a neat, inspirational ending. 13. Tim Roth. Tim Roth has made a career out of being unpredictable. He's played gangsters, liars, cowards, cynics. There's a flicker behind his eyes in almost every role, a suggestion that something inside him already knows how the story ends, and it probably isn't good. He's the kind of actor who never sells you a happy ending without a hint of doubt behind it. In October 2022, his real life caught up with that look in his eyes. His son, Cormac Roth, died at 25. The cause, germ cell cancer, had been publicly acknowledged before his death. Cormac himself had spoken about it. A musician, a creative, a voice not yet fully formed, but already deeply felt by those who knew him. He didn't hide his illness. He faced it with defiance, humor, and heartbreak, often all at once. And then, quietly, he was gone. Tim Roth did not offer a dramatic, sweeping public statement. What he did offer was worse and better: honesty. In the rare interviews he gave after Cormac's death, Roth did something few grieving public figures dare. He refused the neatness. He didn't speak of closure. He didn't reach for meaning. He said flatly, "There is no cure for grief." He talked about being pulled toward work and then away from it, about wanting to abandon a role that mirrored too closely what he was living, and how Cormac encouraged him to keep going. There's a kind of dignity in that grief. Not the noble stoic type, the unvarnished kind, the one that doesn't ask for sympathy or applause, the one that simply sits there, unresolvable, and demands to be acknowledged. Cormac's death is recent, too recent, perhaps, to carry the dust of legacy or the soft blur of nostalgia. It's still sharp, still raw, still close enough that Roth's public appearances carry a tremor beneath the surface. A man whose work was always layered is now layered in a way that has nothing to do with craft and everything to do with survival. And what lingers most isn't the loss alone. It's the fact that Roth has chosen to speak about it, not for attention, not for healing, but because sometimes silence would be dishonest. His son was here. His son is gone. And the absence is not a lesson. It is just that. An absence. And maybe that's where we end. With the honesty no one wants but everyone understands. That even the best performances can't save us from the worst parts of life. That behind every curtain there might be someone broken, still going on stage anyway.